this element of outside interference, it's almost becoming dogmatic. And there are certain individuals associated with wanting to impose a particular point of view, let's say on India and on people here in India. Now, BJP says the latest person to attempt this is George Soros. He's part of a Break India plot. But to many around the world, he is a do-gooding billionaire, crusader for democracy. Now, we are speaking to an authority on the subject of how there is a deep-seated conspiracy to stunt India's growth and its emergence as one of the greatest powers on earth. And one of those individuals, who's also an author, is Mr. Rajiv Malhotra, who has written a series of books on this particular subject, the latest, of course, being a second iteration of his Break India. I want to bring you in on this. Is there truth to the BJP's claim, to the sort of right of center claim that people like George Soros or others are actually militating against India's rise on the global stage?
Well, thank you for having me, Rahul, on this very important event. You see, yesterday, Bloomberg News put out a 2-minute video in which George Soros is directly saying this. George Soros on camera, looking at the camera, reading out something from somebody had briefed him or whatever, says that this Adani controversy, bringing down Adani is equivalent to bringing down Modi. And this is going to put pressure on Modi, who is not really a true democracy, but more of a fake democracy. And then he goes on to say that he's hopeful that things will become more democratic in India as a result of that. This is as clear as it gets from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And this is recently I was on the plane. I just arrived yesterday from the United States. And I think I was somewhere on the plane when this happened. So I would say in the last day or two, this came out straight from Soros, and it's on Bloomberg. So that statement which the BJP is complaining about is absolutely true.
The motive? What about the motive?
So, Soros has been one of those guys claiming to be like God, So I'm rich enough, so now I'll decide what kind of a world we need in the future. And Soros is not the only one. He's the best known among these kind of people. Soros is not the only one, but he's the best known among these kind of people. So there are many other Soros type people, but he's very extreme left, and like Harvard, people in the Democratic Party, people who are on the extreme left they see him as a major source of funding because he spends so much money on all kind of things. And in my book, some of the culprits I pointed out, I named, actually get their funding from him. So Soros is sort of the icon, but he's in his 80s. And you must remember that once in a while he'll show up and make this statement because it has a huge effect. But there are many younger Soroses that are following in his footsteps. Some of them we've named, like Omi Diyar, for example, who's very young, half his age, and extremely active in India as an investor in technology. So this business of people who make a lot of money suddenly get in their head that they will design the world because they know better.
So let me quote
this arrogance of power.
Mr. Malhotra, this is what you've written about George Soros in your own book. George Soros is a Hungarian-American committed to fighting nationalist and conservative governments which he deems to be authoritarian. His organizations in India under his flagship Open Society Foundations started out by offering scholarships and fellowships for pursuing studies and research, but rapidly built a vast network of journalists and media outlets across India that are fiercely anti-India. Now, what he says is that, look, I believe in the power of democracy, and I don't like anyone chipping away at the edifice of democracy. And therefore, I am funding these various independent media organizations, think tanks, call them what you want, who strive to strengthen democracy. At least that's what they claim to be doing. So why are you crucifying me? Why do you think my philanthropy is so suspect? Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so you see, the thing is, democracy is not without institutions. And if you break down the institutions that are democratic, you are actually democracy. So what he has to remember is what works in the United States, and his recipes and his diagnosis of the United States does not apply to India. India's democracy requires the very institutions that he's trying to break down. So if he breaks down a sense of national narrative, which every country has, that's not anti-democratic. I mean, the United States has American exceptionalism and all these. France does, Britain does. Everybody has a grand narrative of their country, but somehow the Vedic or Indian or Hindu kind of a narrative bothers these people a lot, and they think that is stifling democracy because it's hurting Muslims or Christians or minorities of some kind or other. So this is an issue that Indians need to be able to debate very directly with these guys, because they have somehow considered the rise of Indian nationalism and Indian patriotism to be inherently undemocratic, which means if you try to please them on democracy, you'll have to become a weak country. If you're a weak country, you don't have a strong assertiveness, a strong sense of identity for yourself, then of course you're going to be vulnerable. So I don't think that becoming weak makes you more democratic. It actually makes you vulnerable to recolonization and invasion. So in this world, where especially India, surrounded by very nasty kind of a neighborhood, we have to have a strong leadership. So I don't think that there is anything incompatible between that and democracy.
You're right. Another person roped in by Soros' Open Society Foundation is Amardeep Singh, co-founder of the US-based NGO Sikh Coalition. He was appointed by President Obama to his Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Since 2014, he has been working with Open Society Foundation as its senior program officer. The Sikh Coalition website supported the rioters, stating the crackdown, including tear gas, water cannons, baiting charges, internet and resource shutdowns, censorship of journalists, the arrest and detention of activists, and concerted efforts from government leaders and state-aligned media to portray the protesters as terrorists. You also then talk about Soros and the Council of American Islamic Relations. You say that among the farmer activists, the citizens listed as supporters was the Council of American Islamic Relations that has been backing Kashmir separatism. You then also refer to Harsh Mandar. You say that comes with the backing of breaking India heavyweights like George Soros, who has nominated him for the Nobel Prize of 2022. The Soros-funded Peace Research Institute Oslo that nominates for prize made the following announcement. And you go on to say, under Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalist administration, the situation of Muslims in India has become increasingly difficult. Of course, Harsh Mandar is associated with Karwa-e-Mohabbat, which he launched. So you've sort of put under the Soros rubric several individuals who are the critics of the Modi government. Now, some people will say that, look, being critics of Modi, etc., that should not single you out for suspicion. You're doing your job. If you are a, watchdog, or you self-proclaim sort of human rights watchdog, then if you think that there are things going wrong, what's wrong about speaking up for them?
Yeah, I mean, I support that people should criticize the government. I'm critical. I have many things to say about government doing good job and government not doing good job, and it's my right. But at the same time, I know some limits. There are some boundaries. There is some maryada. And, the people who are kind of encouraging violence, encouraging riots, encouraging mob mentality, I think they're crossing the line. So it's a question of Indian laws. It's not somebody like a Soros who has to decide, adjudicate. I think that somebody sitting overseas adjudicating a conflict in India or a controversy in India is not the way to go. This is something Indians made a mistake during the British Raj, going to the British to get them to involve to adjudicate the internal disputes among Rajas and different factions. And the British ended up creating this divide and rule and running the whole country. So I think the lesson we learn is don't go to some foreign agency to sort out internal differences. We got to learn how to sort it out. We have a court system. We have elections, and nobody. The interesting thing is nobody who lost these elections is claiming that the elections were rigged. I mean, I don't think that is the claim. So democracy as such, in terms of electing people, is working. Now, if the electorate are voting for people legitimately in a democracy, then these people are anti-America or anti-Soros or anti some policy coming from overseas. that doesn't mean that it's anti-democracy. It means that the democratic process is working because people are able to rise above the international global pressure and assert their own identities. So I think India is a thriving democracy. I may disagree with a lot of things that Modi is doing, but I do not think that suppressing democracy is one of them.
Okay, a last and final question. Does Soros work alone? Or is he, as some people claim, an extension of the US deep state and other Western anti-India elements?
So, the deep state is a kind of a nebulous concept for a whole lot of, I don't think there is a particular institution. I think there's a whole fragmented forces. Soros is certainly one of them, and there are many others I've mentioned in my book. What holds them together is a kind of a globalist idea that the future of humanity is beyond nation states, and these nation states should be dismantled, which is idealistically fantastic. But if you start dismantling nation states, it's not USA or China that will get dismantled because they're far too powerful. It's the other states that might fall apart. And this is my concern, that the weak states will fall apart in a globalist agenda because their nation states structures and institutions are not so robust. And the very strong ones will actually live to take over the rest. So in the name of globalism, what they'll actually end up creating is another imperialism, another kind of a colonial era where US, China, and maybe some others will rule over the rest. So
Thank you, Mr. Gupta, for speaking to Times Now. George Soros has greatly upset the government and also the Bharatiya Janata Party that has accused him of demonizing India's democracy, and I'm quoting Smriti Irani here. And
brought the Bank of England down. He has sort of created all kinds of problems for other countries. And don't also forget the Arab Spring, quote-unquote Arab Spring, the great bloodshed, which happened because of George Soros's role in it. So he has taken upon himself the task of civilizing the world, and he has the money to play around with. So that's how it happens, and there's nothing new about it, about his role, about his disruptive role, about his destructive role. And it was all along suspected that George Soros had a role in everything that has been happening this past few months, leading up to the Hindenburg report. So now all that has come into the open, and it has come into the open in a very dramatic manner, because the Munich Security Conference is hardly the platform where somebody like George Soros should really be hosted. It is a platform for security-related discussions and how to avoid conflict and how to maintain stability, which is the best guarantor for peace. And here is George Soros, who uses that platform to virtually declare war on India and its democratic institutions and democratic process. And that is patently unacceptable. I don't think it is about the BJP and the government alone, but this is something which hugely impacts every Indian national.
But Mr. Gupta, there are several very established people in the world who are associated with Mr. Soros in one form or the other. To many, he's a do-gooding billionaire crusader for democracy. He's a committed Democrat. His support to the Arab Spring was in the interest of promoting democracy around the Arab world, etc., etc. That's what they say. And they have no qualms about either accepting his money or sharing a platform. Now, some of these individuals operate very freely in India, do praise the Prime Minister. Bill Gates is one of them, if I'm not mistaken. So why is George Soros then such an insidious presence?
George Soros by himself is an extremely insidious person. The organization he runs, the Open Societies Foundations, the Open Society Foundations, is a very insidious foundation. I have no doubts about it in my mind. And this particular organization of his, funded by George Soros, has been used for creating turbulence, economic turbulence, of creating political turbulence, of creating social turbulence. And he, as I began by saying, that he believes that he is some sort of a messiah on whose shoulders rests the onerous task of civilizing the world. Now, thank you very much, but we can do without it. And when you refer to the Arab Spring, I don't think the idea was to sort of inject democracy into the streets of Arab countries, but to create instability for the Arab palace. I mean, this is a different institution altogether. The West will never get how the Arab social, political, and cultural structure operates. And the whole idea was to create disruption, of creating of an insurrection, and which had a very bloody consequence. And frankly, nothing has changed. So the people paid the price for George Soros's interventionism. And Rahul, if you look at it from that perspective, what he said today, or what he said yesterday at the Munich conference, is direct intervention in India's political process, and that is totally, totally unacceptable.
Now, I want to ask you this because the MHA had placed Soros's Open Society Foundations in India under a watch list in 2016, to be precise, for funding organizations that were working outside the ambit of the FCRA. Now, what has come of this entire issue? It's in the courts since 2020. What has come of it? And if there are these very serious criminal accusations against Mr. Soros, why haven't they sort of materialized into action?
Well, the Soros funds were put under scrutiny. And as you yourself say, the Open Society Foundations was put on a watch list, or organizations funded by the Open Society's foundations they were put on a watch list. The matter went to court, and now the court has to decide. But the government itself is very clear that this is not innocent funding for good work. This is funding meant for creating political turbulence. We know exactly, you know, I know, who are the recipients of this money. And interestingly, the vice president, the London-based vice president of the Open Society Foundations, was part of the Bharat Jodo Yatra.
So you believe that the participants...
I mean, this vice president is based in London. He flew down to be a part of the Bharat Jodo Yatra. Now, what that implies is for people to decide and for the Congress to explain, and the reason I mention it is that I think a statement was issued by Mr. Jairam Ramesh saying that we don't need George Soros for this purpose. But the fact is that you did have a very high-level functionary of Soros's foundation as part of the Bharat Jodo Yatra, and they should really try and explain what was this person doing over there, in what capacity did he join the Bharat Jodo Yatra, and why was he allowed to be a part of the Bharat Jodo Yatra, given the track record of Open Society Foundations, and given the track record of George Soros. Rahul, it is also interesting that there are multiple beneficiaries of the Open Society Foundations. And I really don't wish to take names because then it becomes a sort of a slanging match. But there is nothing professional about working for the Soros Foundation. There has to be something more than that. And that is what we should be looking at. And I think it's time we got to the bottom of it.
So my last couple of questions to you. Regime change is what is being hinted at least by the government here.
Is to force a regime change. And in India especially, this is not the first time that he has struck out at Prime Minister Modi or at the government headed by the Prime Minister Modi. He has done so previously also. On several occasions, he has allowed his displeasure with Prime Minister Modi, with the government he heads, to spill into the open, and he has done it in a very brazen manner, with impunity. And again, I think I was explaining to somebody earlier today that there's an emerging new information order which replaces the 1980s UNESCO-fashioned information order. This new information order is largely about narratives, about manipulating narratives, about external influences in internal politics, about influencing political processes, about intervention in elections. And all these pieces of the new information order jigsaw are falling into place in very quick succession over the past few weeks. Mm-hmm. What has happened today is that with Mr. Soros' statement, a very key piece has found its way into the jigsaw puzzle to hold. And this statement, commitment, challenge is about an open declaration of intervention in India's political process, intervention in India's election process, and intervention in India's institutions and the manner in which they function. So,
let me also draw your attention. One of the spokesperson of the Bharatiya Janata Party, Mr. Poonawala, has just tweeted an image of a tweet from Mr. Shashi Tharoor back in 2009 or so, where he says, met old friend George Soros, upbeat about India and curious about our neighborhood. He's far more than an investor, concerned world citizen. That's how Mr. Tharoor at one time described Mr. Soros. And a large number of people, as I began by saying, would agree with him, most probably. And therefore, I want to ask you one final time before we wrap up, Mr. Gupta. Are we today sounding a little like the Indira Gandhi years, where the foreign hand was given so much of an emphasis?
I do not subscribe to conspiracy theories.
Right.
I do not subscribe to the view that the whole world is conspiring against India. That is not true. Look at the way the whole world looks at India today. Had there been some great global conspiracy, the world would not have looked at India the way it looks at India. But having said that, I entirely believe that there are extremely dangerous, disruptive and destructive forces at play. I am entirely convinced that George Soros plays a major role in that. The tweet which you just read out, put out by Shashi Tharoor, goes back to 2009. And George Soros, I think, also visited India to go visit a member of the Nehru clan and said that old friend and etc. etc. So I also am given to believe that some very senior politicians from the UPA ranks, their children work for George Soros organizations. And so that's why I said that there are various beneficiaries in this country. I look at them as collaborators. which would be, such collaborators would exist in every country around the world. They collaborate with people like George Soros to bring grief and destruction to their own country. So I'm not surprised the way it has played out. I don't think it's about some vague foreign hand intervening in India. Here is a man who is known for his interventionism, backed by his billions of dollars, which he has often made by manipulating the markets. Don't forget that he has faced investigation after investigation after investigation for market manipulation. So he's not someone who's free of blemish.
Okay.
And that is why I'm saying that the face which was behind the targeted attacks on India over the past couple of months has emerged. Rahul, a last point. The BBC takes external funding for its special projects, quote unquote. And it would be only fair for the BBC to come clean on who funded the two-part so-called documentary on Prime Minister Modi and India. Unless they come up with a convincing, credible statement explaining who funded the project, we are free to believe that the money came from George Soros's Open Society foundations. It is for the BBC to deny it.
Right.
It is for me to prove it.
Okay. Well, Kanchan Gupta has thrown down the gauntlet there. The BBC. Thank you very much, Mr. Gupta. No one can accuse me of not asking all the direct questions in skeptical tone as possible, and Mr. Gupta of not replying freely and frankly. Thank you very much.
अपने घर और कमर्शियल स्पेसेस